very much. Sabina's and Monica's paper only underscore even more the compelling need for economic inclusion of persons with disabilities, but it also highlights the promise posed by the economic inclusion of persons with disabilities. So in my presentation, I'd like to present the imperatives, the impediments, and the remedies for such economic inclusion. I could just borrow. I will just briefly, quickly go over the imperatives from social philosophy. They're consistent, they're robust, regardless of the ethical method that you use, where we have Cicero's notion of justice as a cardinal virtue, Kant's categorical imperative, David Hume's duty of humanity, Peter Singer's duty of easy rescues, and then if you look at the ethics of care, and then moral cosmopolitanism, all of them would actually call for economic inclusion as a moral obligation. And then if we move on to theology, Christian theology, again, it presents even stronger arguments for the imperative of their economic inclusion. For example, recall the Old Testament and its vision of economic security as a divine gift. And then there's also the biblical principle of restoration that could be extended to include people with disability. And then if we move on to the modern Catholic social tradition, the social principles such as integral human development, primacy of labor, universal destination of the goods of the earth, solidarity, subsidiarity, all of these also all point to the moral obligation to include persons with disabilities in economic life. So, but I'd like to focus more on the economic argument because I'd like to show that even using traditional mainstream economics, neoclassical economic argument, you will actually arrive at the conclusion that it is important, even for the self-interest, even for allocative efficiency. Forgive me for using the reference in terms of the language of neoclassical economics, but I just want to show you how strong the case is that even within mainstream neoclassical economics, there is a case to be made. So let us examine some of the economic imperatives coming from mainstream economics. The first is that of the untapped human potential. So in a study, for example, in Sri Lanka, they discovered that 90% of persons with disabilities were unemployed. So this is just one observation right there. You can just imagine what it must be like in other countries. And prior to the turn of the millennium, they were already looking at figures of over $200 billion a year in lost income because of their exclusion. And so for a student, an undergraduate student in economics, you know that you are well within your production possibilities frontier. So that would be argument number one. This is really untapped human potential. The second argument I'd like to present deals with what we've observed in the last 30 to 40 years. In development economics, prior to the onset of globalization, they would talk of natural comparative advantage. Natural comparative advantage where you are essentially, your economic growth is a function of your natural resources. So if you're rich in commodities, you make your money by exporting commodities. If you're labor rich, that means that you export labor intensive goods. So your comparative advantage is determined by your natural resources, which is why they call it the natural comparative advantage. We all have experienced that this has changed in the last 30, 40 years. It is no longer natural comparative advantage. It is created comparative advantage. because we are now in the era of microelectronics. This is the microelectronics revolution that has inaugurated, or that has been instrumental in the knowledge economy that we currently have. And a very good example of this is Bangalore. Bangalore, India, they really took advantage of the Y2K uh, problem, and they simply kept right on moving up the value chain of software development. And today, they have some of the powerhouses when it comes to software. And so when we are talking of created comparative advantage, you can leapfrog other nations, as Bangalore has been able to accomplish. You can see the importance of not excluding people just because of their disability, because they can create enormous economic value. If you really want to think in economic terms using mainstream language, they are value creators. And you are simply leaving a lot of value on the table. Uh, and it's a self-inflicted wound to exclude people who are disabled. So that would be a second argument. A third argument is that we now have seen new technologies coming out that actually mitigates some of these disabilities. And so that would mean that the cost of integrating people with disabilities into the economy would actually be much lower. So if you use economic analysis, think of it as a change in the factor prices. It gets cheaper to actually accommodate, to hire people with disabilities. And so again, this is another argument. And in addition to this, observe that globalization and the internet has essentially opened up the world for entrepreneurial persons with disability, because you can actually market to the entire world with the internet. For self-employed persons with disabilities, the internet has just simply opened a whole new world that is now open to them, including, this would also include back office outsourcing, copy editing, computer-assisted design, accounting, and so this is really a godsend for their economic inclusion. A fourth argument that can be made builds on what we have actually just seen from Sabina's and Monica's paper, in that if you are talking of poverty alleviation programs, if you really want it to be effective, you simply have to include components that address the inclusion of people with disabilities, but not only with people with disabilities, but families with disabled members of the family, because it is not merely the disabled person who is suffering, but the whole family is affected. And so it becomes even more difficult for caregivers to get a job in the formal sector, because their hours are because of the hours that they have to spend providing care. So they eventually end up working in the informal sector. And the informal sector is not really satisfactory, because it's very poor income, very low productivity, no social benefits, and the skills. I mean, most of them would essentially be a dead-end job. And so, for any effective poverty alleviation, it is important to address and include persons with disabilities as well. One final argument I'd like to present, and this is not, by the way, an exhaustive listing. This is just a sketch. This is just a sampling, given the time that I have. But it is actually out of employers' self-interest to employ persons with disabilities, because in a study by Thomas Eichner, this is a fairly recent study, 2021, he surveys the empirical studies made. And he discovered that persons with disabilities are excellent hires because of their higher work motivation, their work ethic, their company loyalty, their friendlier interaction with customers, their higher job satisfaction, their consistency in job performance. And so this is not one empirical study. This is a pattern that he discovered across all the studies that he had actually synthesized. And this is a 2021 study by Thomas Eichner. The reference is in my paper if you want to dig it out. And there are actual anecdotal accounts to back this up, because in the era of the Great Resignation, this was during the COVID crunch in terms of hiring people. And so the job turnover was very high, really giving employers a headache in terms of the churn in their workforce. They discovered that persons with disabilities were actually much more reliable because they will not quit on you. They will not quit on you. They are loyal. And so that is something that was discovered during the era of the Great Resignation, immediately after COVID. Let me just go over some of the impediments. Just make sure that, okay, I have time. Let me go over some of the impediments. Impediment number one is the assumed or the perceived lower relative productivity. And so if you really work out the mathematics of this, the household production model, you can actually formally show why they would be much more expensive to hire, and why employers would really be afraid of hiring. So there's an assumed lower relative productivity, both in terms of the perception and in terms of theory as well. And of course, the study that I had just mentioned from Thomas Eichner would show that they can compensate for whatever real productivity differential there are. They're able to compensate for this with better work ethic and greater loyalty. So that is the first impediment. The second impediment is the cost of accommodation. In terms of, to begin with, as had already been mentioned in the earlier presentations, disability is not a homogeneous phenomenon, and it's heterogeneous in terms of there are many types of disabilities, so you can't really avail of economies of scale in providing accommodation, because you simply have to keep on, they have to be custom made. And so this raises the cost, and it intimidates private firms, as as we will see later on. Just installing elevators, chair lifts, they can really be very expensive. Another impediment is the mobility problem. For persons with disabilities, they may really want to find work, but at the same time, if buses, for example, or sidewalk are not really PW friendly for the disabled, then it will really be a difficulty for them. And even for major developed nations, even in major metropolitan areas, you will find that it's not easy to navigate some of the streets if you are disabled. So if this is a phenomenon in major metropolitan areas of the global north, you can just imagine how much worse it is in the global south. So this is a real problem. Another problem that is consistently mentioned in studies and in interviews is discrimination, in that people stereotype disabled people. They're viewed to be less productive, unreliable, with avail of sick days. And so right off the bat, it's a real hurdle for them. It's a real hurdle for them to be able to get over such discrimination. I'd like to give an anecdotal evidence to back up the claim on the cost of accommodation and the discrimination. So the American Disabilities Act was circa 1990. And so they did a 20-year study. After 20 years of this act, they did a study. And one finding that they have is that most persons with disabilities actually opted to work for the public sector. They actually wanted to work for the public sector. Most of them were actually in the public sector for those who joined in after this Disabilities Act. And this to me suggests that the cost of accommodation matters. Government, is not subject to market discipline for the most part. Private firms are cost conscious because they are subject to market discipline. And then on top of that, I think another reason for why there's a preference for the public sector is job security. Job security, which suggests to me that perhaps discrimination is much more difficult to avoid in the private sector. One last impediment I'd like to underscore is that for the global South, the economic inclusion of persons with disabilities may not really be at the top of their priorities, because as it is, providing jobs for non-disabled people is a real headache for the global South. So you can just imagine, the priority that they will have in the global South. They will be kept on bumping. They will be bumped all the way to the rear. So they will be most likely at the back of the queue. So this is another impediment, especially seen in the global South. Let me now quickly go over some of the remedies in the time that I have, 10 minutes. So among the remedies, there are extra market remedy solutions. There are solutions outside of the market. And the first thing is that of government stepping in to treat the economic inclusion of persons with disabilities as a merit good. You see, the private sector, a private firm, will not internalize all the positive social externalities, the positive externalities of including persons with disabilities. They will not factor that into their calculation. In other words, the social benefits are actually a lot more than the private benefits that they're including in their calculation. As a result, there will be an underemployment of persons with disabilities. And so this is where the solution here, and it's recognized as a market failure, and there is a solution for this. The solution for this is to treat it as a merit good. And it's government that can really step in, because government has its fiat power, and then in addition to that, it can provide subsidies and tax credits as well. So this is one remedy that presents itself. One word of caution, however, there is a limit to how far government can act, because if government is not careful, they can actually cause more problems, as in the case of over-legislating and over-regulating the market to the point of discouraging people from, hiring people with disabilities. So this is something that they have to be cautious in the way they target their legislation. They can cause more harm than good. And then the next, the obvious thing for an extra market solution is for government to target their poverty alleviation to families with disabled people. So it has to be a targeted poverty alleviation program. Conditional cash transfers or unconditional cash transfers is something that comes to mind as a possible way of alleviating their poverty, especially in light of one finding that sees that among the poor are not homogeneous. There are people who are not so poor, and there are what you call the ultra poor. And they found that many of the disabled people belong to the ultra poor. So this is where you can really target all those programs to that segment of the poor. I'd like to talk about market-based solutions. For market-based solutions, one obvious thing is fair trade, where people are willing to pay a higher cost, just as they pay for chocolate, coffee, and the others, for goods and services provided by the disabled, that they're willing. So fair trade and social enterprises, you actually see chains, coffee shops, ice cream franchises that really specialize in incorporating the disabled people. Another initiative is that of educating the public to dispel the disabused people of their of the discrimination and their wrong ideas about the disabled people. And you actually see this. Mattel just came out with a doll, a Barbie, with Down syndrome. This is fairly recent. And then British Vogue had as on their cover page a model with Down syndrome. And then there's an NGO, Autism Speaks. They buy expensive national television ads to alert people that people with autism can actually function in the same way that others can. So it's a way of educating the people, educating the public. Now, a third market-based solution is sub-minimum wages, where government will permit firms to pay less than minimum wages to people with disabilities. I would be the first to alert you to this. This is highly controversial. In the US, there are certain states that legislate against this for moral reasons. Because, you know, to give it to sub-minimum wages is to simply embrace the thinking that, you know, your wage is equal to the price multiplied by your marginal productivity, you know, the economic equation. So they're just against this. That, so just be aware, I don't really have the time to go through the arguments here, but be aware that this is a very controversial, it's a contested remedy, sub-minimum wages. There's no consensus on this. And then the final market-based solution I'd like to underscore is that of remote work. And this is, again, something that is backed by very recent empirical evidence that I'd like to share with you. Because in the wake of the COVID pandemic actually became a natural experiment, because in the wake of COVID, observed the following empirical evidence from the United States. Since the pandemic, 1.8 million persons with disabilities joined the labor force. This is in the US, 1.8 million. This additional labor is a huge jump of 28%. 28% jump in labor force participation compared to 1% to the general population. The jump of 28% for persons with disabilities compared to 1% for the general public. By August of 2022, the U.S. Labor Department reports that 25% of persons with disabilities were now part of the labor force. This is 25%, with 21% of them being employed. These are the highest ever recorded for these statistics. Now you can see that part of an explanation for this is because of the worker crunch, the great resignation. So the employers were really hard-pressed for workers. But I think we can also infer from this that the flex time, the remote work were very important forms of assistance, were very important forms of including those with disability into the workforce. And so I'd like to end with that anecdote on the importance that remote work, all of these other remedies, market-based solution, Solutions are, difficult, like fair trade, social enterprises, they're difficult to scale up. But remote work is something that can really make a big difference. I thank you for your attention.